Remember when a movie about 4 kids walking along train tracks hit harder than half the serious dramas that adults were watching? Released in 1986 by Columbia Pictures, Stand By Me featured 4 kids, one summer, and a journey that starts as a wild adventure and ends as something that none of them or anyone watching ever quite shook off. The film starred Wil Wheaton as Gordy, River Phoenix as Chris, Corey Feldman as Teddy, and Jerry O'Connell as Vern. 4 performances so natural, it barely registered as acting at all. And behind the scenes, this movie had almost as much chaos as the story it was telling. These are 15 weird facts about Stand By Me. And stick around for number 2, because the most celebrated dialogue in the film wasn't even in the script. And once you hear how it actually happened, you're never going to watch that movie the same way again. But before we get into it, hit that like button and subscribe. It helps more retro movie fans find these deep dives, and we drop new ones every week. All right, who's ready to see a dead body? Let's get into it. Number 15, Michael Jackson almost hijacked the whole thing. Now, at some point during Stand By Me's release strategy, a studio executive had an idea. Post-Thriller Michael Jackson, still the biggest pop star on the planet, would record a new cover of Stand By Me for the film. Guaranteed chart hit, massive opening weekend, full pop culture event. Rob Reiner? Yeah, he said no. The logic from the studio side wasn't crazy. Jackson could have sold this film to audiences who'd never heard of Stephen King, Rob Reiner, or Castle Rock. Commercially, it made complete sense, but creatively, it could have been a disaster. Imagine a quiet, deliberately paced film set in 1959, suddenly now soundtracked by the biggest pop voice of the 80s, doing a full production number over the end credits. Yeah, that's not an enhancement, that's demolition. And Reiner wasn't just turning down Jackson. The songwriters behind Stand By Me, Jerry Lieber and Mike Stoller, assumed that Reiner would want a big contemporary name to re-record it for modern audiences. The queen of rock and roll, Tina Turner, was the kind of artist that they had in mind. Reiner surprised everyone by saying he didn't want any of it. He wanted the original 1961 Ben E. King recording, exactly as it was, because he saw the film as a period piece and the song as part of the identity. Not a soundtrack choice, but a time capsule. The result was one of the smarter calls in the film's production. Stand By Me re-entered the charts on the strength of the movie. It reached the top 10 all over again and did it as a 25-year-old recording. Ben E. King got a second wave of success without anyone needing to remix a single note. Number 14, 4 kids, 1 film crew, and extremely optimistic supervision. 4 preteen boys, 1 movie production, and what appears to have been a supervision strategy built entirely on hope. What could possibly go wrong? Quite a lot, as it turns out. Let's start with Jerry O'Connell's babysitter.
It's 1:15. You better go get the food. Junkyard opens at 3. Chopper will be here.
O'Connell, 11 years old and apparently a problem solver, decided that he wanted to visit a fair near the shoot. His babysitter said no, so he tied her to a banister and snuck out anyway. Now, the fair, as it turned out, was a hippie fair. O'Connell saw fair and thought rides and funnel cake. What he got was, well, cookies. Marijuana-laced cookies, specifically. He had no idea. He ate them anyway. 2 hours later, the crew found an 11-year-old future sitcom star crying in the park while the film's production team collectively reconsidered their career choices. That was just the warm-up. Now, back at the hotel, the boys treated the property like a personal obstacle course. Pool furniture went into the water, not accidentally tossed, but deliberately arranged underwater like some kind of abstract art project that nobody commissioned. Wil Wheaton figured out how to fix the lobby video games so they could all play for free, and River Phoenix, egged on by everyone else, ended up covering a car in mud, only to discover that the car belonged to Kiefer Sutherland, the man already playing a menacing bully on screen. I mean, outstanding target selection. Corey Feldman later said that the production marked genuine firsts for him. His first exposure to alcohol, first exposure to drugs, his first cigarette, and what he described as a level of freedom that really could have used a few more responsible adults in the immediate vicinity. Number 13, every cigarette in the film was actually a burning vegetable. The boys in Stand By Me smoke with the kind of practice cool that only 12-year-olds trying to impress each other can pull off. What they were actually smoking was cabbage, and no, not the kind that your uncle smokes in grandma's basement. Director Rob Reiner was firmly anti-smoking and refused to put real cigarettes anywhere near the cast. Completely reasonable position. But what replaced them was slightly less dignified. Cabbage and lettuce rolled up and lit on fire. Every brooding drag in the movie is actually a kid smoking burning salad. According to the cast, the taste was exactly what you'd expect from smoldering produce. It was bitter, harsh, and just deeply unconvincing to anyone who had to actually experience it while trying to look unbothered on camera. Reiner kept the kids away from nicotine and tobacco, which of course is the correct call. He just replaced it with something that reportedly made the whole experience actively unpleasant in a completely different direction. The boys had to sit there performing effortless cool while their mouths were staging a quiet protest. It's one of the more committed acts of on-screen deception in 1980s cinema. The cigarettes looked real, the attitude looked real, but behind the scenes, the props department was raiding the produce aisle. Number 12, the most terrifying scene in the film was mostly a lie. That train trestle scene made every kid watching it grip the couch cushion a little tighter. 4 boys on a narrow bridge and a locomotive bearing down on them. And absolutely nowhere to go. It feels immediate. It feels inches away. But in reality, the train was not that close, and the kids weren't anywhere near it. The production used a 600mm telephoto lens, which compresses distance and makes objects look significantly closer than they actually are. That locomotive barreling toward the boys at what appears to be point-blank range was, in reality, far down the track. And Reiner confirmed that the boys in the train were never actually on the trestle at the same time. The actual crossing with the locomotive bearing down was handled by 4 adult female stunt doubles made up to look like the cast. Plywood planks were laid across the ties so they could actually run. So where does that look of sheer terror on Wheaton and O'Connell's faces come from? Rob Reiner. The boys had done the running scene repeatedly and looked completely unbothered, because they were. They weren't near a train, they weren't in danger, they were just jogging down a bridge on a hot day. Finally, Reiner snapped. He screamed at them that the crew was exhausted from reshooting, that it was their fault, and then directly threatened to kill them if they didn't get it together. They immediately burst into tears. Reiner rolled the cameras, and that was the take that made the film. The most genuinely terrified faces in that scene had nothing to do with the locomotive. The boys were scared of the man that was holding the megaphone. The locomotive itself, McCloud River Railroad number 25, a steam engine built in 1925, is still out there. It now operates on the Oregon Coast Scenic Railroad, presumably without anyone threatening children near it. At least I hope. Number 11, the movie almost died twice before anyone saw it. 2 days before cameras were supposed to roll, Stand By Me nearly ceased to exist. Embassy Pictures, the production company behind the film, was suddenly sold to Coca-Cola. Yes, the soda company. In the mid-'80s, multinational beverage corporations were out here acquiring movie studios the way the rest of us were collecting garbage pail kids. The new ownership looked at this quiet little story about 4 kids walking along train tracks and found a dead body, and they made a very corporate decision. They pulled the plug. Project dead. Thanks for coming. Now here's the part that makes this whole thing even more absurd. The man who sold Embassy to Coca-Cola was Norman Lear. The same Norman Lear who built half of television with his bare hands. All in the Family, The Jeffersons, Good Times. He sold the company, Coca-Cola killed the film, and then Lear turned around and wrote a personal check to bring it back to life anyway. $7.5 million. Flat out bet on Rob Reiner and the story. Entirely on his own with no distribution deal in place. That should have been the end of the drama, but it wasn't. After the film wrapped, every major studio in town passed. Paramount passed, Universal's head walked out halfway through the screening, Warner Brothers passed. I mean, Hollywood looked at the movie with 4 kids, a summer, and a lot of feelings, and just collectively decided that this isn't their problem. The industry, they wanted spaceships. This movie had a treehouse. Then someone named Guy McKelvin. He was the new production head at Columbia, and he had already passed on the film once. CAA's Mike Ovitz pushed him to give it one more look. McKelvin wasn't feeling well, so he screened it at his house with some colleagues. His 2 daughters were in the room. About halfway through, both of them were in love with River Phoenix. McKelvin himself was crying. He called Norman Lear afterwards, and he said he wanted the picture. He didn't care if it made money. Stand By Me went from a casualty of corporate soda money to one of the most beloved coming-of-age films ever made. On the strength of a 6 studio executive, his 2 daughters, and a 15-year-old with good cheekbones. Number 10, the title was accidentally invented during a guitar lesson. The original title of the film was The Body, which sounds less like a heartfelt coming-of-age story and more like something that you'd find in the horror section between 2 VHS tapes you'd never actually admit to renting. Columbia Pictures agreed. The title? It had to go. What replaced it wasn't the result of a studio brainstorm or a marketing committee burning through a whiteboard. It started on set during downtime, because River Phoenix was learning guitar and getting good at it fast. Kiefer Sutherland, the same guy spending his days on set terrorizing 4 kids as the menacing Ace Merrill, was playing and singing Stand By Me one afternoon. Phoenix heard it. He said he loved the melody and had never heard the song before. Sutherland started teaching it to him. Rob Reiner happened to walk by, heard it, and said that he hadn't heard that song in a long time, and he loved it. And that, according to Sutherland, was the end of the discussion. Months later, when Columbia Pictures needed a new title, Reiner suggested Stand By Me. Screenwriter Reynold Gideon later described it as the least unpopular opinion. Sutherland has said the enthusiasm around the song on set was part of the conversation that led there, though he's careful not to take full credit for the rename. Still, a bully teaching his on-screen victim a song during a break in filming with the director walking by at the exact right moment, that's either a great origin story or a very convenient one. But either way, it worked out considerably better than the body would have. Ugh. Number 9, Meathead got the job because someone needed a vacation. Rob Reiner was not the first call. That honor went to Adrian Lyne, the man behind Flashdance, 9.5 Weeks, and eventually Fatal Attraction, a director whose entire filmography runs on bad decisions made by attractive people. Warm childhood nostalgia, not exactly his lane. Lyne had been attached to the project early. He helped the producers pitch it around town and was pretty genuinely enthusiastic about the story. But then he finished 9.5 Weeks and decided what he really needed was a vacation. And he told the producers that he couldn't start until spring of 1986. The producers told him that they couldn't wait that long. So Lyne, he packed a bag and accidentally handed off one of the most beloved films of the decade on his way out the door. Rob Reiner stepped in. At that moment, his directing resume consisted of This Is Spinal Tap and The Sure Thing, a mockumentary about a heavy metal band that couldn't find the stage, and a road trip rom-com. Genuinely good films, but also genuinely not the obvious audition tape for a deeply emotional Stephen King adaptation about grief, friendship, and growing up. But Reiner read the script and zeroed in on Gordy immediately. Not just because it was a good character, but because it was personal. Reiner grew up as the son of comedy legend Carl Reiner, constantly in the shadow of someone more celebrated, and never quite sure where he ended and his father's fame began. Gordy, invisible in his own family, overshadowed by a brother his father actually noticed, that was a story that Reiner already knew. He didn't just want to direct it, he needed to tell it. That focus changed everything. In Lyne's hands, this could have been a slick, stylized coming-of-age thriller, but in Reiner's, it became something that still catches people off guard 30 years later, when it shows up on cable at midnight. Number 8, one small Oregon town never stopped being Castle Rock. Now, most filming locations wrap production, wave goodbye, and then go back to being anonymous. But Brownsville, Oregon took a completely different approach. The small town served as the real-world stand-in for Castle Rock during filming. And it wasn't originally supposed to be Oregon at all. King's novella was set in Maine, as many of his stories are, but Reiner was so taken with Brownsville during location scouting that he moved the story setting entirely. Decades later, the town still draws fans making the trip specifically to walk the same streets, stand in the same spots, and soak in the same small-town atmosphere that the film captured in 1985. The storefronts and streets have stayed largely intact, which means that the whole experience lands somewhere between visiting a filming location and actually stepping inside the movie. Brownsville went further than preservation. They built a celebration around it. The town hosts an annual Stand By Me Day, a full event complete with guided tours of filming locations, vintage cars, sock hops, and a blueberry pie eating contest. Because if you're going to commit to honoring this film, you may as well go all the way to the Barf-O-Rama. Castle Rock was a fictional town from a Stephen King novella. It needed a real address. Brownsville, they raised their hand, and 30 plus years later, still holding the title. Hey, quick pause. If this deep dive is hitting the way that we think it is, go ahead and hit that like button. Subscribe so you don't miss the next one, and drop a comment with your favorite Stand By Me moment. And if you and 3 of your best friends camped in the woods for a weekend doing God knows what, ring that bell to help us remind you of all the great films and shows of your childhood. All right, let's get back to Oregon. Number 7, finding the right narrator took a lot more trials than expected. The narration in Stand By Me sounds like a memory, the kind of voice that makes you feel like you're sitting with someone who's been carrying a story around for 30 years and finally decided to let it out. It's one of my favorites. It sounds like it was always going to sound exactly that way, but it wasn't. Director Rob Reiner went through multiple actors trying to find someone who could thread that very specific needle. Reflective without being sentimental, emotional without being theatrical, nostalgic without tipping into greeting card territory. David Dukes was the first serious attempt, and it went far enough that Dukes actually filmed footage as the adult Gordy. I mean, he shot the role. If you watch closely, that first long shot of the adult Gordy sitting in the car at the opening, that's still Dukes. He was never fully replaced in every frame. But then came Ted Bessel. He didn't land either. Then, Reiner turned to Michael McKean, the same Michael McKean who had just played Derek Smalls, the bassist of Spinal Tap, in Reiner's previous film. The man who helped Reiner perfect the deadpan delivery of heavy metal buffoonery was briefly considered to voice the emotional soul of a coming-of-age story. That did not work out. Finally, Reiner called Richard Dreyfuss, his friend going back to high school. Dreyfuss brought a quiet vulnerability to it, the voice of someone who had lived enough to understand that some memories don't fade. They just settle deeper. Every line of that narration sounds less like a script and more like something that he's been turning over in his head for years. By the time those final lines arrive, the ones about friendship and the people that you knew at 12, it doesn't register as narration. It registers as someone telling the truth. Reiner just needed to find the right person to tell it. It took a Derek Smalls detour to get there. Number 6, the dead body almost wasn't a person at all. The moment when the boys finally find Ray Brower is where Stand By Me stops being an adventure and becomes something else entirely. The tone shifts, the jokes stop, and the kids who spent the whole film pretending to understand the world suddenly have to confront the fact that they don't. Here's what most people don't know about that scene. The production's original plan was to use a plastic dummy. That plan was scrapped when the crew realized that a mannequin wasn't going to cut it. What they needed was someone who could actually look dead, still enough, real enough, present enough to make 4 kids and an entire audience feel the weight of it. The solution came from an unlikely source, a 20-year-old college student named Kent Luttrell who had responded to an ad in his university newspaper looking for photo doubles. He spent most of the production as a stand-in for Corey Feldman, teaching the boys how to throw a football and climb a fence because, as he put it, none of them were athletic to any degree at all. Not exactly a stepping stone to playing a corpse, but here we are. Makeup artist Monty Westmore got to work. The job took less than 2 hours. Luttrell lay completely still while the cameras rolled, and Reiner got what he needed. Now, what didn't make the final cut was arguably the most unsettling part. Live black beetles were placed in Luttrell's mouth, meant to crawl out on camera when Reiner gave the signal. That footage, it exists. It was cut, but the scene was already doing enough. The kid who played Ray Brower, he wasn't a child actor. He wasn't kept in isolation and wasn't originally part of the plan. He was a college sophomore who answered a newspaper ad and accidentally ended up in one of the most quietly devastating moments in 1980 cinema. Number 5, Gordy's breakdown was a real thing. Gordy LaChance is the emotional center of Stand By Me, the quiet kid who feels invisible, who carries grief like it's standard equipment, who can't quite convince himself that anyone in his life actually sees him. It's one of the most affecting performances in all of the film. It also wasn't entirely a performance. Wil Wheaton has been open about the fact that he didn't choose acting. His parents pushed him into it. His mother coached him as a small child to walk into her agency and tell the agent that he wanted to do what mommy does. He's since described his upbringing as involving emotional abuse from his father and manipulation from his mother. A home life built on pressure, control, and the particular exhaustion of a kid who never had much to say in his own story. Which means while Gordy was on screen processing neglect and the suffocating feeling of being overlooked, Wheaton was living a version of that same reality off camera. He said that when he watches the film now, he can't ignore the sadness in his own eyes, and that it was exactly that sadness and isolation that gave Gordy what he needed to come to life. Wheaton didn't realize until he was in his 40s that he wasn't playing Gordy, he was Gordy. It's why that performance lands differently from everything around it. It feels uncomfortably honest, like accidentally walking in on something private. Years later, Jerry O'Connell, 11 years old during filming, publicly apologized to Wheaton on his talk show for not recognizing what his friend was going through on set. Wheaton accepted. O'Connell said being 11 wasn't an excuse, and Wheaton told him that he couldn't have known. The kid who played the invisible boy spent a long time making sure that other people felt seen, and he's still doing it. Number 4, Rob Reiner didn't run a film set. He ran a psychology experiment. The friendship between those 4 boys doesn't read like choreographed movie chemistry. It reads like the real thing. Kids talking over each other, laughing at the wrong moments, saying things that land harder than they were probably supposed to. Well, that texture didn't come from a good script alone. Before a single camera rolled, Reiner put the boys through weeks of theater games in a hotel suite in Oregon. Improvisation exercises, trust drills, unstructured time together. Reiner called the Viola Spolin theater game book his directing Bible. By the time production started, they weren't performing a friendship. They really had one. Inside jokes, a shorthand, the kind of easy comfort between people that no amount of rehearsal can manufacture from scratch. Then came the emotional scenes, and Reiner shifted gears entirely. For the milk money scene, where Chris breaks down talking about the right thing and gets punished for it anyway.
And I could go someplace where nobody knows me.
Reiner pulled River Phoenix aside before the take and gave him a single direction. His exact words, as he later recalled them, quote, "You don't have to tell me what it is, but think about a time that an adult, somebody important to you, let you down and you felt like they weren't there for you." That was the whole note. The next take is the one in the film. Phoenix went somewhere, and nobody knows where. He never told Reiner, and Reiner never pushed. He said he suspects it was about Phoenix's parents, but he doesn't know. What he does know is that after he called cut, Phoenix didn't stop. The crying continued, real and uncontrolled. The kind that doesn't switch off on command. Reiner stepped in and held him, fully aware that he'd reached something much deeper than a performance. Reiner knew exactly where to press, and he pressed. What that says about him as a director is complicated, but the results are all over the screen. Number 3, Stephen King left his own screening unable to speak. Stephen King built an entire career putting people in a cold sweat. Killer clowns, haunted hotels, cars with grudges, entire towns that couldn't catch a break. I mean, that man is more responsible for sleepless nights than, like, caffeine. So naturally, the story that finally cracked him open was 4 kids walking through the woods. The novella The Body was published in his 1982 collection, Different Seasons, and King has described it as the only nakedly autobiographical story he'd ever written. Gordy LaChance was King. Chris Chambers was based on a real friend, and that single collection is responsible for a genuinely unhinged amount of cinematic firepower. It also produced The Shawshank Redemption and Apt People. One book, 3 wildly different adaptations, 3 completely different genres. King apparently contained multitudes. At a private screening in fall of 1985, King was visibly shaking and couldn't speak. Reiner recalled that after the film ended, King said that he had to go away, and he left the room for about 15 minutes. When he came back, he told Reiner it was the best film ever made from anything he'd ever written. And then he told him why it hit so hard. The story was autobiographical. Those boys on screen were real people from his childhood. And all 3 of them, the real versions of Gordy's friends, had died. King was watching his dead friends come back to life on a movie screen. When the movie was over, King hugged Reiner. His words, written decades later as a tribute to Reiner after his death, "I was moved to tears because it was so autobiographical." Which is exactly why Stand By Me doesn't feel like a Stephen King story. It feels like his life. Number 2, the most natural dialogue in the movie wasn't in the script. Now, most child actors in the 1980s were working under a very specific set of expectations. You hit your mark, say your line, don't touch anything expensive, and do not improvise unless you have a very patient adult to explain why that's not how this works. Now, Rob Reiner had a completely different idea. Rather than locking the cast into rigid line readings, Reiner coached the boys to perform the dialogue rather than recite it, to interrupt each other, talk over each other, and let conversations breathe the way that they actually would between kids who'd known each other for years. He wasn't handing them new material, he was trusting them to make the written material feel unwritten. And the material was worth trusting. The screenplay, written by Reynold Gideon and Bruce Evans, was nominated for an Academy Award. And a significant reason it works is because so much of it came directly from Stephen King's own memories. The debate about whether Mighty Mouse could beat Superman, the arguments about Goofy's species, the Pez speech. King wrote those conversations because he had those conversations. 12-year-old boys in 1959, they talked exactly like that, because King was one of them. What Reiner did was find 4 kids who were essentially the characters that they were playing, and then spent weeks building genuine chemistry between them before a camera rolled. By the time that they delivered that dialogue on screen, it had the texture of something discovered rather than rehearsed. The Mighty Mouse argument doesn't feel written. It does feel like something that actually happened somewhere, in some field, in some summer that nobody quite remembers clearly anymore. That was the whole trick. And it took King writing it, Gideon and Evans scripting it, and Reiner directing it for the seams to disappear completely. Number 1, the Barf-O-Rama recipe was even more disgusting than it looked. The Barf-O-Rama sequence is one of the more gloriously unhinged detours in 80s cinema, a pie-eating contest that escalates into a full-scale chain reaction of human misery, and it almost wasn't in the film at all. Rob Reiner genuinely debated cutting it. Gordy, the character telling the story, was supposed to grow up to be a great writer. Reiner kept asking himself, would a future great writer actually tell a vomit story? He eventually concluded, yes. He made his peace with it and committed entirely. Good call. Now, here's what was actually in that fake vomit. Large curd cottage cheese mixed with blueberry pie filling, combined on purpose by adults who were presumably paid for their expertise. But getting that nasty mixture from a container to the screen took considerably more effort than the script makes it look. The first attempt used a power washer filled with blueberry pie filling. The actor playing Bill Travis, the man lard-ass projectile vomits on, was hit with several hundred PSI of pie. That didn't work. What replaced it was a 10-gallon cylinder with a plunger on top and a hose that snaked up Lindberg's leg under his shirt and was taped directly to the side of his face off camera. 5 crew members pushed the plunger simultaneously to force the mixture out. The hose was 3 inches wide. All Lindberg had to do was open his mouth as wide as possible and turn his head. Now, for the crowd scenes, extras were handed numbered plastic bags of blueberry filling to conceal in their mouths. When their number was called, they expelled it. During one take, a 5-year-old in the front row started crying and actually threw up on himself for real. Lindberg isn't sure if that take made the final cut. Now, the scene was filmed over 5 days. Fresh blueberry pies arrived from a local bakery every morning. The sugar crystals on top repeatedly cut Lindberg's nose. The castor oil that lard-ass drinks, well, that's water and RC Cola. And to this day, Andy Lindberg can't eat blueberry pie. The Barf-O-Rama is a prop vomit masterpiece that required a power washer failure, a custom pneumatic rig, dozens of numbered plastic bags, and one accidentally sincere 5-year-old to pull off. absolutely worth it. And there you have it, everyone. 15 weird and wild facts about Stand By Me. Which one surprised you the most? Well, drop it in the comments and share this with a friend who still quotes this movie at least once a year. And don't forget to like, subscribe, and ring that bell. Until next time, watch out for those leeches. This is Remember When.